Damon Fletcher had always been a man who valued routine. A lawyer by profession, he preferred the quiet certainty of his structured life, a life where risks were calculated and predictability ruled. He wasn't the type to court trouble, not in a world where every decision had consequences. But all of that was about to change, and it began on an ordinary afternoon at a convenience store in Fort Worth, Texas. Damon had just finished scanning his items at the self-checkout counter, his thoughts on the simple snack and coffee he'd just purchased. It was supposed to be a quick stop before heading home, but as he grabbed his plastic bag, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching him. A strange prickling on the back of his neck made him glance around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Until a voice cut through the quiet of the store. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." Damon turned, confusion washing over him as he found himself face to face with a uniformed officer, her hand resting near her holstered weapon. Officer Erica Manning stood with an air of authority, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Is there a problem?" Damon asked, his voice cautious but composed. Her eyes never wavered. "I saw you put something in your pocket after you scanned a few items," she said, her tone flat. "Mind showing me your receipt?" Damon frowned, glancing around the store, certain there must be some mistake. "I just paid," he said, shifting his bag to his other hand. "You can check the register." Her lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes narrowing as she raised her voice slightly. "I said, show me your receipt." Damon, his patience starting to wear thin, slowly reached into the bag and pulled out the small slip of paper, extending it toward her. The receipt was clear, showing the items he'd purchased. Manning snatched it from his hand, barely glancing at it before shaking her head dismissively. "Nice try. Empty your pockets." Damon's heart rate quickened as the tension in the store escalated. People around them began to turn their head, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "I don't have anything in my pockets," he said, keeping his voice calm. Manning's eyes remained cold as she snapped, "Empty them now." Damon clenched his jaw, aware of the unspoken hostility in the air. He had seen it before, this kind of interaction, seen it in the eyes of countless people who looked like him, people who knew that the moment they were accused, it was over. He wasn't just a man in the store now. He was a suspect, guilty until proven innocent. And as much as he hated it, he knew arguing wouldn't help. "I'm telling you, I didn't take anything," he said, his voice level but firm. Manning's hand dropped to her radio, speaking into it with clipped efficiency. "I've got a possible shoplifting suspect resisting compliance." Resisting compliance? Damon exhaled slowly. He was standing still, hands visible, his voice steady, and yet none of that seemed to matter. A young store clerk looking nervous in his company vest stepped forward. Actually, I saw him pay for everything," the clerk said, his voice tentative. Manning didn't even look at him. "Stay out of this," she snapped. Damon's heart pounded in his chest, the realization hitting him hard. This wasn't just about a missing item. This was about something else entirely. "Look, you're making a mistake," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I'm a lawyer. I know my rights." Manning snorted, her lips curling into a derisive smirk. "Yeah? Well, you can explain your rights downtown." Before Damon could protest further, her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with a firm grip. A flash of irritation and frustration surged within him, but he stilled. He could pull away, argue, resist, but he knew that would only escalate the situation. So he let her. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his skin as she guided him toward the door. Outside, as Damon caught a glimpse of his reflection in the store's glass door, he felt a strange, surreal shift. He had seen plenty of people in this position, but now for the first time, he was the one being led away in cuffs. And though the moment felt like a punch to the gut, Damon knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to end the way Officer Manning thought it would. The ride to the police station was eerily silent, save for the occasional crackle from the radio. Damon sat in the back of the squad car, his hands cuffed behind him, staring out at the blurred cityscape as it passed by. He had been arrested before, but this was different. This time, the cuffs were around his wrists, not someone else's. This time, he was the one facing the consequences of a wrongful accusation. He had been through countless cases in his career, defending people who had been wrongfully accused, who had found themselves trapped in the justice system with no way out. And now here he was, caught in the same trap. But this time, he had the tools to fight back. Manning drove with an air of calm, one hand on the wheel, the other near the radio, her face expressionless. It was clear she had done this 1,000 times before, arresting people, putting them through the system, acting as though it was all just part of the job. Damon wondered if she even thought about the lives she ruined with each arrest. He stayed quiet, his mind racing. What now? He had been falsely accused, humiliated in front of a store full of strangers, and now he was on his way to jail. But the more he thought about it, the more his resolve strengthened. He wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. When they pulled up to the station, the heavy gray walls loomed over him like a monolith. Manning parked the squad car with a sense of finality, opening the back door with the same practiced motion as if she was escorting a suspect to the same routine she had carried out 100 times before. "Let's go," she said, her voice sharp as she stood waiting for him to get out. Damon didn't resist. He stepped out of the car, standing tall, his head held high despite the handcuffs. He could feel the eyes of the officers inside the station on him, could sense the weight of their glances as they watched him walk past. He had seen this before from the other side. Men like him, dragged through the system and forgotten, their faces lost in the shuffle. But not today. He was determined to make sure his name wouldn't be lost in the system. Not now. Manning led him past the front desk, where an officer with tired eyes and graying hair looked up. He barely spared Damon a glance as Manning handed over his personal belongings, including his wallet, without a word. "Shoplifting," Manning said casually, as though it were the most routine thing in the world. Had to detain him. He was getting hostile. Damon's jaw clenched. Hostile? He had barely raised his voice, yet she had labeled him as such. The word stung because he knew it wasn't true. But in this world, words like hostile and resisting held weight. They had a way of turning a man into a villain, even when he had done nothing wrong. A younger officer, perhaps in his early 30s, glanced at Damon's wallet and froze when he pulled out a bar association card. "Wait a minute," the officer said, his eyes flicking from the card to Damon. "You're a lawyer?" Damon exhaled through his nose, offering a curt nod. "Yes." Manning scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sure he is." The young officer glanced at the card again, his expression softening. "He's telling the truth," he said, looking at Manning with a raised eyebrow. "Are you sure about this charge?" Manning's face tightened. "He stole from the store." The officer hesitated, then glanced back at Damon. "Sir, do you have a lawyer?" Damon nodded, his voice steady. "I don't need one." The officer seemed almost amused. "You're going to represent yourself?" Damon met his gaze. "Absolutely." Manning's patience, it seemed, was wearing thin. With a sharp sigh, she turned on her heel. "Fine. Get him processed," she muttered before walking away. Damon was escorted down a long hallway, past rows of holding cells. He had seen this before from the other side, representing men who had found themselves on the wrong side of the law, waiting for a chance to clear their name. Now he was the one in the holding cell, the one watching the minutes crawl by, unsure of what would happen next. He knew how this worked. They'd hold him for as long as they legally could, hoping he'd crack under pressure. They'd try to force him into a plea deal, or worse, let him sit in jail over the weekend to make him learn his lesson. But he wasn't going to give in. Not this time. The door creaked open, and a guard stepped in, his uniform creased and his face impassive. "You're being arraigned in the morning," the guard said, his voice devoid of emotion. Damon nodded, his mind already working through his strategy. This wasn't just about proving his innocence. He was going to make sure this never happened to another man like him again. Officer Manning had thought she was in control, but she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The courtroom felt colder than Damon expected, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a sterile glare on the polished wood of the judge's bench. He sat at the defense table, hands folded neatly in front of him. His suit jacket was freshly buttoned, but the cuffs from the night before still felt like a weight on his wrists, a constant reminder of the humiliation he had endured. Across the room, Officer Erica Manning stood, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. To her, this was just another routine case, a simple shoplifting charge that would soon be wrapped up and processed like so many others before it. But to Damon, this was anything but routine. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses and glanced at the prosecutor. "Let's move this along," she said. "What are the charges?" The prosecutor, a young man with an overconfident smirk, stood up and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant, Damon Fletcher, was caught stealing from a local convenience store. Officer Manning witnessed the crime firsthand and detained him after he refused to comply with her instructions." Damon leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his breathing. The prosecutor's words hung in the air, but they felt more like a bad fiction than the reality of what had actually happened. He wasn't just defending his innocence. He was fighting to expose the lies that had been woven around him, and he was ready. The judge turned to Damon. "Mr. Fletcher, do you have legal representation?" Damon stood up, his movements deliberate and steady. His eyes met the judge's, his voice clear and unwavering. "I do, Your Honor. I will be representing myself." A murmur rippled through the small audience in the back, and even the prosecutor's smirk faltered slightly. But Manning didn't flinch. She had seen men like Damon before, men who thought they could play the system. She probably believed this would be over in minutes. But Damon knew better. This was just the beginning. The judge nodded. "Very well. Mr. Fletcher, how do you plead?" "Not guilty," Damon said, his voice firm, unwavering. The judge turned to the prosecution. "Let's hear the officer's testimony." Manning stepped forward, her heels clicking against the courtroom floor. She stood tall and confident, her posture perfect, her eyes never leaving Damon. "Your Honor," she began, "I was on patrol when I entered the convenience store and saw the defendant pocket an item without paying. I approached him and asked to see his receipt, which he failed to produce. He then became argumentative and refused to comply with my instructions." Damon couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. This testimony was sloppy. He had seen bad testimonies before, but this one felt particularly thin. The story was already starting to unravel. The judge turned to Damon. "Mr. Fletcher, you may cross-examine the witness." Damon stood, adjusting his tie with a calm precision. His steps were measured as he moved to the front of the defense table. He rested his hands lightly on the wood, his gaze fixed on Manning. "Officer Manning," he began, his voice steady, "you said you saw me take an item and put it in my pocket?" "Yes," Manning responded, her voice sharp. "And you claim that I didn't produce a receipt?" Damon continued, his tone even. "That's correct," Manning replied. Damon nodded slowly, pacing slightly in front of her. "Were there security cameras in the store?" Manning hesitated for just a moment, but Damon caught it. "Yes," she said after a slight delay. "But that footage hasn't been reviewed yet." Damon turned to the prosecutor, his gaze unwavering. "Did your office request the footage?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Damon and the judge. "It wasn't deemed necessary at the time," he muttered. Damon let that information hang in the air for a moment, before turning back to Manning. "Officer Manning, you also stated that I refused to comply. In what way?" Manning straightened, her jaw tightening. "You became aggressive, refused to empty your pockets when asked, and resisted when I attempted to detain you." Damon pressed his lips together, taking a slow breath. "Interesting," he said, his voice calm, but the words cut through the courtroom like a knife. "Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence. My purchase receipt, which was in my possession at the time of the arrest." Damon walked over to the bailiff, handing over the neatly folded receipt. The judge examined it, her brows lifting slightly as she glanced over her glasses at Manning. "This receipt shows that Mr. Fletcher did in fact pay for all of his items," she said, her voice measured. "Officer Manning, did you examine this receipt at the time of the arrest?" Manning stiffened, her face flushing slightly. I must have overlooked it," she said, her voice faltering. Damon's gaze never left her. "You must have overlooked it," he repeated, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air. The judge let the silence stretch just long enough before speaking. Officer Manning, do you have any body cam footage of the arrest? Manning's hesitation was palpable. My body cam was malfunctioning, she said quickly, but the words seemed hollow in the room. The judge's eyes narrowed. You didn't mention that in your report, she observed, her voice cold. Damon turned back to Manning. So no body cam footage, no security footage reviewed, and a receipt proving my innocence that was ignored? He let out a low chuckle, but the tension in the room had already shifted. Tell me, Officer Manning, were you absolutely sure I stole something? Or did you just decide I look like someone who would? A sharp intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Manning's face flushed with anger, her hands balling into fists at her sides. But Damon wasn't done yet. Officer, do you have a history of wrongful arrests? Damon asked, his voice calm but forceful. Manning's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. That has nothing to do with this case, she snapped. Damon raised an eyebrow. Doesn't it? He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to request a review of Officer Manning's past arrest reports. The prosecutor shot up from his seat. Objection! That's irrelevant to this case. The judge waved a dismissive hand. Overruled. Let's hear it. The bailiff began pulling up files on a screen. Damon looked back at Manning, his eyes steady. Public records show you've had 3 complaints of racial profiling in the last 2 years alone. A murmur ran through the courtroom as the room seemed to tighten around Manning. Her fingers twitched at her sides, her breath shallow. How many of those cases involve black men? Damon asked, his voice quiet, but carrying a heavy weight. Manning shifted uncomfortably. That has nothing to do with this case, she repeated, her voice tight. Damon smiled slightly. Doesn't it? He let the question hang in the air, his eyes never leaving her. The judge studied him for a long moment before speaking. Officer Manning, at this point, it's clear that Mr. Fletcher was not only falsely arrested, but that your actions were both biased and negligent. She turned to the prosecutor. I move to have this case dismissed immediately. The prosecutor looked defeated, his shoulders slumping as he sank back into his chair. Manning stood frozen, her face pale, the realization that she had miscalculated beginning to sink in. The judge slammed her gavel down. Motion granted, case dismissed. Damon exhaled slowly. He had won. But this wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about something bigger. The courtroom was thick with silence as the gavel fell. Damon stood there, feeling the weight of the moment press against him, the finality of the judge's ruling sinking in. The case had been dismissed. He had cleared his name. But this was not just a victory for him. It was a victory for something bigger, a fight for justice, fairness, and accountability. Damon took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, and he glanced at Officer Manning. Her posture was rigid, her face pale, and her jaw clenched as if she were trying to hold on to something, her pride, her belief that she had been in the right. But it was over. She had underestimated him. The system had failed, but today it had worked, even if only for one person. As Damon gathered his things, the courtroom doors swung open, and a man in a dark suit walked in, an official from the police department. He exchanged a quiet word with the bailiff before approaching the judge's bench. The judge nodded, then turned back to Manning. Officer Manning, the judge said, her voice crisp, you are hereby placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation into your actions, both in this case and in your previous complaints. Manning's face twisted with shock and disbelief. This isn't fair, she protested, her voice sharp. The judge held up her hand, cutting her off. That's not for you to decide. She turned to the bailiff. Make sure the appropriate parties receive my recommendation. Damon watched as Manning was escorted out, her steps heavy, her face pale with the weight of the consequences now settling on her shoulders. The court had made its decision, but the broader consequences of her actions were only just beginning. For Damon, this was not about revenge. It was about making sure the system could be held accountable. People like Manning needed to know that their actions had repercussions, especially when those actions led to the suffering of innocent people. As Damon walked out of the courtroom, he stepped into the bright midday sun, the cool air brushing against his face. He had won, but it wasn't just a personal victory. It was about something more profound. He had fought for justice, well, not only for himself, but for anyone who had been falsely accused, overlooked, or mistreated by a system that often didn't care to look beyond the surface. He couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility, one that would continue beyond this moment. As he reached the steps outside the courthouse, he was met by the young officer, the one who had hesitated when Manning had handed over his wallet, the one who had recognized the truth before anyone else had. The officer jogged up to him, out of breath, but his eyes held a genuine respect. "I just wanted to say, what you did in there, that was something," the officer said, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. Damon raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The officer shrugged, his tone quieter now. "I mean, I see cases like this all the time. People arrested over nothing, stuck in the system because they can't fight back. It happens more than it should, but I've never seen someone turn it around like that. Not in court." Damon studied him for a moment, his voice soft but firm. "You ever speak up when you see it happening?" The officer shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his gaze dropping. "It's not that easy." Damon nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Neither was proving my innocence." The officer looked down, clearly struggling with the weight of the unspoken truth. "Manning's not the only one like that on the force," he muttered, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "But not all of us are like her." Damon turned and looked at him, his voice steady. "Then prove it." The officer met his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "I will." He turned, disappearing into the crowd, his back straightening as if he had made a decision. Damon stood for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about changing the system, one small step at a time. It was about forcing people to look beyond their biases and to see the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When his mother answered, there was a relief in her voice. "Everything okay, baby?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Damon smiled slightly. "Yeah, Mom, everything's okay." He glanced up at the clear sky, the weight of the last few days lifting from his shoulders. "I think I know what I want to do next." There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean?" Damon leaned against the railing, his mind already working through the next steps. "I want to start something, maybe a legal defense fund, something for people who don't have the means to fight back." His mother's voice softened, filled with understanding. "That's a big undertaking, baby." Damon smiled, his decision solidifying. "Yeah, but I think it's the right thing to do." She was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "I think you're right." Damon slid his phone back into his pocket, feeling a sense of purpose settle within him. The system had failed him, but today he had proven that even when everything seemed stacked against you, the truth could still win. And as long as he had the knowledge, the means, and the courage to fight, he wasn't going to let anyone else suffer the same fate he had. He walked away from the courthouse, his steps purposeful, his mind focused. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Lesson from the story. This story highlights the importance of standing up for justice, even when the system seems rigged against you. Damon Fletcher's journey shows that knowledge, patience, and a clear understanding of one's rights can make a significant difference in the face of wrongful accusations. At its core, the story is about accountability. Officer Manning believed her authority would go unchallenged, but Damon's refusal to accept a false narrative forced her actions to be scrutinized. It's a reminder that no one should be above the law, and no one should ever be presumed guilty without proper evidence and a fair process. Damon's victory was not just about clearing his name. It was about creating a ripple of change, one where those in power are held accountable, where the overlooked and the vulnerable can find a voice, and where the truth has a chance to be heard. This is a call to action for us all. Injustice thrives when silence prevails. Each of us has the power to speak up, to challenge what is wrong, and to push for a better, fairer system. Whether in the courtroom or in everyday life, the fight for justice is not just for the individual, but for the community at large.